She was only 7 years old, trembling on the cold clinic floor, her tiny voice barely louder than a whisper. The nurse who saw the strange marks on her back knew something was terribly wrong, but she had no idea her discovery would unleash a chain of events that changed everything. When a seasoned police officer arrived with his loyal German shepherd, the truth hidden behind those bruises began to unravel. What they uncovered was darker than anyone in town dared to imagine, and the little girl's courage would leave the entire community in tears. If you believe children deserve protectors like this, tell me, what would you have done if this happened in your city, that state? The little town of Seabrook, Maine, woke slowly on winter mornings. The harbor outside still smelled of salt and rope. The gulls screeched above the masts, and the frost made patterns on the clinic's glass doors like ghostly ferns. Inside, the Seabrook family clinic was warm but weary, its walls crowded with children's crayon drawings of whales, houses, and smiling stick figures. On the vinyl chairs in the waiting room sat a small girl clutching a canvas backpack so tightly the fabric wrinkled in her fists. Her name was Harper Miller, 7 years old. Harper was delicate in build, with long, light brown hair braided so tight it gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Wisps curled rebelliously at her temples. Her pale skin was dotted with a scatter of freckles, and her eyes, gray-green, large, solemn, watched the fish tank without blinking. She seemed to shrink into her sweater, a faded navy piece patterned with tiny white stars. Her posture was straight, disciplined, as though even at her age she knew how to appear correct when others were looking. Beside her stood Richard Miller, the man who had adopted her years earlier. He was in his mid-40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with the polished appearance of someone who knew the value of presentation. His camel overcoat hung perfectly, his leather gloves were immaculate, and a neatly trimmed beard framed his strong jaw. His dark hair was brushed back with precision, salted at the temples in a way that made him look distinguished rather than old. His eyes were a hard bottle-glass blue, and though he smiled often, that smile never reached those eyes. In Seabrook, Richard was spoken of as a respectable man, successful in business, generous with town donations, an upright father raising a girl alone after the tragic death of his wife. His reputation was like a shield he carried easily. The clinic door opened with a hiss, and in walked Nurse Sarah Whitmore. She was 36, tall and long-limbed, with the fit grace of someone who jogged at dawn. Her hair, a medium brown, was tied back into a practical braid, and faint silver strands threaded near her temple. Her freckled face was open and steady. Her hazel eyes carried both warmth and alertness. She wore simple blue scrubs and a thin silver chain around her neck with a small medal of saint, brigid that caught the light when she moved. Sarah's presence was calm, but she had a keen way of noticing details others missed. Years of experience had taught her that emergencies rarely announced themselves with drama. Often they whispered through bruises, silences, or nervous eyes. "Harper? Mr. Miller?" she called, chart tucked under her arm. Richard rose smoothly, placing a large hand on Harper's shoulder, as though to guide her every step. "Come along, sweetheart," he said, with a voice warm enough for the receptionist to hear, yet firm enough for Harper alone. The hallway to the exam rooms was decorated with colorful charts and posters. Harper obediently removed her shoes for the height chart, standing still while Sarah lowered the measuring bar. "Good growth," Sarah said cheerfully. "Are you eating your superhero breakfasts?" Harper gave a small nod, her lips pressing into something almost like a smile. Richard answered instead, his voice cutting in with authority. "She's very well cared for. Private lessons, balanced meals, a structured routine." Sarah simply nodded. "Structure's good," she said pleasantly, though her eyes lingered a fraction longer on Harper. Inside exam room 3, Harper perched on the crinkling paper of the table. Richard remained standing, arms folded, his coat still buttoned, as if he couldn't imagine being informal, even in a clinic. Sarah began the routine: temperature, pulse, blood pressure. Harper's vitals were steady. Yet Sarah noticed how Harper flinched when a clipboard clattered in the next room. She noticed the faint yellowing crescent of a bruise peeking above the neckline of Harper's sweater. The girl's silence was louder than any words. "Any illnesses recently?" Sarah asked lightly. "No," Richard replied smoothly before Harper could answer. "No allergies, no medications beyond vitamins." "Great," Sarah said, jotting notes. Then she set a folded gown on the counter. "The doctor will want a full exam. Harper, you'll just slip this on opening in the back like a cape. I'll help her, Richard said quickly. Harper's fingers gripped her sweater hem. I can do it myself, she whispered. Richard hesitated, jaw tightening briefly. All right, he said. Do it properly. Sarah smiled as if nothing unusual had been said. Mr. Miller, would you mind filling out an updated family history form with Maggie at the front desk? The system update made things messy, and it'll only take a few minutes. Richard's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, but then he nodded, polite again. Of course. He left, his polished shoes tapping down the hall. When the door latched, Harper exhaled quietly. She changed with deliberate care, folding each garment into neat rectangles as though perfection could keep her safe. When the sweater and shirt came away, Sarah's practiced calm hid the surge of alarm. Across Harper's small back were thin, straight lines, pink, red, some faded to yellow, too uniform to be accidents. Old marks layered beneath fresh ones. On her upper arms were faint shapes, almost like fingerprints pressed too hard. Sarah knelt beside her. Cold, isn't it? These rooms never stay warm. Her tone was gentle, as though talking about the weather, not the injuries. Harper pulled the paper gown around her shoulders. It's okay, she whispered. Sarah adjusted the gown ties. Sometimes kids get bruises from bikes or monkey bars, she said softly, but these look like they came from something else. Did somebody hurt you? Harper froze, eyes wide, lips trembling. After a long silence, she whispered, I make mistakes. Daddy gets angry when I'm bad. Sarah's throat tightened, but her voice remained calm. You are not bad, Harper. You did nothing wrong. Tears pooled in Harper's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly, as if crying itself were a punishable act. Sarah made her decision. She clicked a quick photo for Harper's medical record, careful to frame only what was necessary. Then she tucked the camera aside and placed a reassuring hand near Harper's, not touching without permission. Thank you for being brave, she said softly. I'm going to talk to some friends who can help keep you safe. You don't have to be afraid right now. From the hallway came the sound of Richard's voice, light and conversational with the receptionist. Sarah smiled at Harper, masking her tension. I'll be right back, she whispered. At the small desk in the corner, she lifted the phone and dialed quietly. Her words to the dispatcher were steady, professional. This is Nurse Sarah Whitmore at Seabrook Family Clinic. I need an officer for a protective call regarding a minor. Non-violent at present. Guardian in the building. Potential interference risk. She hung up, drew one deep breath, and returned to Harper, who sat on the exam table hugging herself in the thin gown. Sarah pulled up a stool, her voice light. Do you like grape lollipops, or are you on the cherry team? Harper gave the faintest hint of a smile. For a moment, the heavy air lifted. Sarah knew it wouldn't last, but help was already on its way. And for now, that was enough. The faint hum of the clinic's radiator filled the hallway when Officer Daniel Harris pushed open the side door. He moved with a kind of careful certainty, the kind of gait that belonged to a man who had walked into rooms carrying both danger and comfort. Daniel was 39, a tall man, just over 6 feet broad-shouldered, with the strength of someone who had not abandoned physical training, even after years on the force. His dark hair was trimmed close, a few gray strands glinting at his temples, and a faint line of stubble traced his square jaw. His nose bent slightly to the left, the remnant of a bar fight he'd once broken up in his early years on patrol. His eyes, a stormy blue, carried both weariness and gentleness, eyes that had seen too much and yet still hoped for better. He was known in Seabrook as calm, respectful, a man who listened before he spoke, yet there was a weight in him, a history. Years ago, on a frigid night, he had led a winter search for a missing boy. By the time Daniel found him, the child was gone, and Daniel carried that night like a stone in his chest. It was a wound invisible but permanent, the kind that made him watch children a little longer, listen to their silences a little harder. At his side, padded Rex, his partner of 5 years. Rex was a German shepherd with a thick double coat, the color of roasted coffee, a black saddle marking his back, and a creamy blaze along his chest. His ears stood tall, one with a small notch at the edge from an overeager fence jump in training. He was large, powerful, but his eyes deep amber were steady, thoughtful. At 5 years old, Rex carried the maturity of a seasoned working dog, patient, disciplined, and yet, when around children, unshakably gentle. His harness bore the patch K9REX and, just beneath it, a faint smudge of a sticker, a cartoon shark a child had pressed there during a school demonstration. The clinic receptionist, Maggie, a middle-aged woman with round glasses and a quick, nervous smile, stood up quickly. "Officer Harris, thank you for coming so fast," she whispered, her hands fluttering as though they wanted something to do. Daniel nodded, lowering his voice. "Where are they?" "Exam room 3, Nurse Whitmore is with the girl. The father, Mr. Miller, he's still filling out paperwork." Rex shifted beside him, ears angling toward the hall, as if already memorizing the new sounds. Daniel gave him a quick pat on the shoulder, then moved down the hall, his boots soft on the linoleum. Inside exam room 3, Nurse Sarah Whitmore glanced up as the door opened. Her relief was visible in her eyes, though her face remained composed. "Officer Harris," she greeted quietly. "This is Harper." The little girl sat on the edge of the exam table in the crinkling paper gown, her knees pressed together, her arms crossed over her chest like a fragile shield. Her braid had loosened slightly, strands escaping to frame her pale face. The silence in the room seemed thick, fragile as glass. Daniel softened his posture, lowering his voice. "Hi, Harper. My name's Daniel. This here is Rex." He gestured toward the dog, who sat promptly at his heel, then sensing the tension in the room, slowly lowered himself onto the floor, stretching out with deliberate calm. Rex's head rested on his paws, his tail giving one slow, reassuring thump. His eyes locked gently on Harper, waiting. Harper's wide eyes darted toward the dog. There was a tremor in her lip, a hesitation, then the tiniest flicker of longing. Her small hand shifted on her lap, as though itching to reach. "Can I," she whispered. "Ask him," Daniel said softly. "He's polite." Harper slid off the table, her bare feet and socks touching the cold tile. She crouched carefully, offering the back of her hand like someone had taught her once. Rex sniffed once, then pressed his nose against her hand, warm and solid. The girl exhaled, the kind of exhale that carried days of held breath. Then, with sudden desperation, she wrapped her arms around Rex's neck and buried her face in his fur. Rex didn't move, except to shift his weight so she wouldn't topple him. His tail swept the floor once. Sarah's throat ached as she watched. Daniel kept his voice even. "You're safe, Harper. You can tell us what happened." For a long time, the only sound was the radiator and the faint crinkle of paper beneath Harper's feet. Then she whispered, muffled into Rex's coat, "Daddy hits me when I'm bad." Daniel exchanged a glance with Sarah, his jaw tightening, though his expression stayed calm. He crouched to Harper's level, careful not to crowd her. "Thank you for telling me, Harper. That's very brave." The girl lifted her head slightly, her cheeks flushed from crying into her fur. "Mommy sees me from heaven," she whispered, voice shaking. "She tells Daddy when I need to be punished." The words, heavy and haunting, hung in the air. Sarah's eyes burned, but she stayed composed. Daniel swallowed, steady. "Harper," he said gently, "I need to write down what you just told me, so we can make sure people understand. Nurse Sarah is also going to take some pictures, so the doctor and the people who keep kids safe can help you. Is that okay?" Harper hesitated, then gave the smallest nod, her hand still tangled in Rex's fur. Daniel rose, pulling a small notepad from his chest pocket, his handwriting careful, deliberate. He documented her exact words. His voice remained soft, but his tone carried authority. "We'll keep you safe. You did the right thing by speaking up." Sarah retrieved the clinic's camera, her hands steady, though her heart pounded. "Harper, I'll take just a few photos for your chart. I'll be very quick." Harper held Rex tighter, and Rex remained perfectly still, a living anchor for the child. Click, click. The camera's shutter broke the silence. Richard Miller's laughter echoed faintly down the hallway, too loud, too forced, as he chatted with the receptionist. The sound made Harper flinch, clutching Rex more tightly. Daniel's eyes hardened. He slipped the notebook back into his pocket and leaned closer to Sarah. "We'll need every photo and a written statement. This isn't going to stop here." Sarah nodded, her eyes set with determination. And in that small exam room, while Richard remained oblivious in the hall, the first fragile truth had finally been spoken. The door to exam room 3 swung open with a controlled push, the kind that announced authority before a word was spoken. Richard Miller entered, his polished shoes tapping once against the tile before he stopped. His eyes flicked from the small figure of his daughter, still seated close to Rex, to the calm, steady form of Officer Daniel Harris crouched at her side. The smile he wore when he'd left for paperwork was gone. In its place was a thin, pressed line across his lips, a look that seemed carved from stone. Richard's presence filled the small room. At 45, he was tall, his broad shoulders filling his camel coat. His neatly trimmed beard framed a strong jaw, though his cheeks were flushed now with heat that had nothing to do with the clinic's radiator. His eyes, ice blue, sharp as shattered glass, landed on Harper first. "What is this?" His voice, smooth in public, had an edge here, sharp enough to slice. "Why is my daughter sitting on the floor like that?" Harper flinched but did not move, her hands still tangled in Rex's thick fur. The dog remained still, head lifted, amber eyes fixed on Richard with the unblinking steadiness of a sentinel. A low vibration began in his chest, not yet a growl, more like a reminder that he was paying attention. Daniel stood slowly, his height nearly matching Richard's, but his bearing entirely different. Where Richard radiated control and intimidation, Daniel radiated calm weight, a steadying presence. His stormy blue eyes met Richard's with patience. "Mr. Miller," he said evenly, "I'm Officer Harris with the Seabrook Police Department. We received a call of concern for Harper's well-being. I'm here to ensure she's safe." Richard's eyebrows shot up, feigning incredulity spreading across his face. "Safe? She's my daughter. Of course she's safe. She fell—" He gestured broadly with one gloved hand. "From a horse last week. Kids fall, they bruise. This is absolutely absurd." His voice rose slightly, enough for the receptionist down the hall to pause her typing. Nurse Sarah Whitmore, standing near the counter, squared her shoulders. She was tall and lean, her hazel eyes steady, though her pulse quickened. "Mr. Miller," she said carefully, "the marks we've seen on Harper are not consistent with accidental injuries. As a nurse, I'm obligated to report them." Richard turned on her with sudden sharpness. "Obligated, or looking for trouble? My wife and I were patients here for years. I've supported this clinic more than anyone in this town. And now you accuse me of, what exactly? Neglect? Abuse?" His voice snapped on the final word, the air in the room tightening like a wire pulled taut. Daniel remained still, his tone unchanging. "No one is accusing at this moment, but concerns have been raised. We will document and investigate. That's the procedure." Richard's jaw clenched, muscles shifting beneath his beard. "And you expect me to tolerate this circus?" His eyes darted again to Harper, still curled against Rex's neck. The dog's body, tense but quiet, remained between them, a living barrier. When Richard stepped forward, Rex's throat issued a low, unmistakable growl. The sound vibrated the paper cups on the counter. Richard froze, his lip curling. "You keep that animal away from my child?" Daniel's voice was firm now, the steel beneath the calm. "Rex is doing exactly what he's trained to do, protect. And right now, Harper has chosen to stay with him." The child clung tighter to the dog's fur, her face pressed against the thick coat. She did not speak, but her silence said everything. Richard exhaled through his nose, a sharp, frustrated sound. "You're twisting everything. My daughter has an active life. Accidents happen. This—" He gestured at Harper again. "This is nothing more than a bruise from riding. She's a sensitive child. She dramatizes." Sarah's voice cut in, quiet but resolute. "Harper never dramatizes, Mr. Miller. She barely speaks at all. And what she whispered today—" She stopped herself, unwilling to betray the child's confidence without procedure, but her meaning was clear. Daniel raised a hand slightly, steadying the room. "Mr. Miller, we're not here to argue. We're here to ensure Harper's safety while an investigation is conducted. Until then, she won't be returning home with you." The words landed like stones. Richard's face darkened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You cannot take my daughter from me. You have no grounds." Daniel's voice remained steady. "We have enough grounds to remove her temporarily for her protection. The Department of Child Services will review immediately. You may speak with your attorney, but for now, she comes with us." Silence filled the room, broken only by the hum of the radiator and the faint sound of Harper's uneven breathing. Richard's eyes, cold and furious, locked on Daniel. For a moment, it seemed he might push further, might test the barrier of man and dog before him. Rex's growl deepened, teeth flashing white for just an instant. Richard stopped. He straightened, smoothing his coat as though wiping anger from his body. His smile returned, but it was brittle now, brittle enough to cut. "This town will hear about this. You'll regret humiliating me like this." Daniel didn't flinch. "Our concern is Harper, not reputations." Sarah stepped forward, gently placing a hand on Harper's shoulder. "Sweetheart, we're going to make sure you're okay. You can take Rex's lead. We'll walk together." Harper looked up, her gray-green eyes wide but steadier now, with Rex beside her. She nodded once, a tiny but monumental act of courage. Daniel gave the command, low and firm. "Rex, heel." The dog rose smoothly, positioning himself directly between Harper and Richard. His amber eyes never left the man as Sarah guided the child toward the door. Richard did not move. He only stood there, his smile fixed, watching as his daughter was escorted away under the watch of a man and a dog who would not yield. And in that small clinic in Seabrook, the balance of power shifted. For the first time, Richard Miller did not control the room. The Seabrook Police Department never slept, though on quiet winter nights it seemed to doze. The building, a brick structure from the 1950s with square windows and peeling white trim, hummed with fluorescent lights and the occasional crackle of a police radio. Officer Daniel Harris walked through the double doors, carrying a small bundle Harper Miller wrapped in a clinic blanket. At his heel padded Rex, the German shepherd, moving with his silent confidence, his amber eyes scanning the dim hallways. Inside, a few officers glanced up. They were used to Daniel, a man of few but weighty words, bringing in troublemakers or lost hikers. But tonight was different. He carried not a criminal, not a suspect, but a child. Sergeant Linda Carson, the desk sergeant, rose from her chair. She was a woman in her late 50s with cropped gray hair and a no-nonsense face softened by years of watching over rookies. Her posture was upright, her uniform crisp, but her eyes pale blue, lined at the edges, were kind. "Evening, Harris," she said, lowering her voice when she saw Harper. "Is this the girl?" Daniel nodded. "Harper Miller, 7, temporary protective custody." Linda's eyes flickered to Harper, then softened. "We'll set her up in the back office. Quietest place in the building." Harper's grip on the blanket tightened. She pressed closer to Daniel's side, her small braid brushing against his sleeve. Daniel crouched so his eyes were level with hers. "You'll stay here tonight, Harper. It's safe. Rex will be with you. I'll be nearby the whole time." Harper nodded faintly, eyes darting to Rex, who sat upright like a sentinel. She placed a hand on his neck, and his tail thumped once against the floor. Linda led them down the hallway, past bulletin boards crowded with shift schedules and faded photographs of fishing contests. The back office was small, used mostly for paperwork or storage. Daniel moved quickly, pulling a cot from the wall and laying out fresh sheets. He shook out a thin blanket, folding it over with military precision. "Not much," he admitted, "but it'll do for tonight." Harper stood in the doorway watching. The fluorescent light gave her pale skin a fragile glow. She clutched her backpack now, instead of the blanket, as though it were the only piece of home she had left. Daniel placed the cot near the heater, then set a pillow at the top. Rex circled once before lying down directly beneath it, his body stretched long, his head resting on his paws. He looked up at Harper, waiting. The little girl climbed carefully onto the cot, her small body folding into the blanket. For a long moment, she was still, eyes wide, until Rex shifted and pressed his warm flank against the frame. The vibration of his slow, steady breathing filled the silence. Harper let out a soft exhale. Then, almost shyly, she whispered into the dim room, "You're my protector." Her lips curved barely into the first real smile Daniel had seen. It was small, fragile, but it existed. Daniel, standing at the desk with his notepad, felt something in his chest loosen. "He's a good protector," he said quietly. "Best I've ever known." The girl's eyelids fluttered. For the first time in perhaps years, she began to look like a child ready to sleep. But sleep didn't come easily. She stirred, sitting up again, her small hands fidgeting with the zipper of her backpack. She pulled out a box of crayons and a folded sheet of paper. She looked at Daniel, hesitant. "Can I draw?" she whispered. "Of course," Daniel said, pulling the desk lamp closer. "Draw whatever you want." Harper bent over the paper, her small hand moving in jerky, intense strokes. The crayon scraped loudly in the quiet office. She used heavy lines, pressing hard. First, a house appeared, square and plain, smoke curling from the chimney. Then a woman with tears falling down her cheeks. Beside her, a child drawn small, almost shrinking into the page, and next to them, a tall man holding what was unmistakably a belt drawn in thick black crayon. Harper stopped, dropped the crayon, and stared at the page. Her hand trembled. Daniel leaned closer, his stormy blue eyes narrowing with both sorrow and fury. "Is this what happened, Harper?" he asked gently. She nodded without speaking, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. Rex lifted his head, sniffed softly at the girl's knee, then pressed his muzzle into her side. She wrapped her arms around his neck, hiding her face in his fur. Daniel's jaw tightened. The memory of another child, the one he hadn't been able to save years ago, burned in him. But this time was different. This time, he would not be too late. He placed a steady hand on the desk, near the drawing, but not touching it. "Thank you for showing me," he said. "This will help us protect you." The clock ticked on the wall. Outside, the sea wind rattled the window panes. Inside, in the small office of a Maine police station, a child had spoken her truth not with words, but with wax and paper. Daniel turned off the desk lamp, leaving only the soft glow from the hallway. Harper curled on the cot again. Rex pressed close beneath, her hand resting on his fur. Her breathing steadied, slow and even, until at last she drifted into the uneasy peace of sleep. Daniel sat in the chair by the door, the drawing folded carefully in his notebook. His eyes stayed on the child, then on the dog, then back again. And in that watchful silence, he knew. The battle for Harper's safety had only begun. Morning light spilled across Seabrook, pale and wintry, turning the harbor mist into silver. Officer Daniel Harris rose early, still carrying Harper's crayon drawing folded in his notebook like a fragile piece of evidence. The picture of a crying mother and a man with a belt was no longer a child's sketch. It was a clue. By the time Daniel returned to the station, Detective Mark Ellison was waiting. Ellison was in his early 50s, a seasoned investigator with a wiry frame and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow. His dark hair, streaked heavily with gray, was cropped short, and his nose bore the slight bend of an old brake. Years on the job had carved lines around his brown eyes, lines of both suspicion and weariness. He was a man respected for persistence. He never left a case unfinished. But he carried the burden of a messy divorce, the cost of devoting himself more to crime scenes than his family table. "Morning, Harris," Ellison said, his voice rough like gravel. "Heard you've got a mess with the Miller kid," Daniel nodded. "More than a mess. She showed us bruises, whispered the words. And then she drew this." He slid the folded paper across the desk. Ellison studied the drawing, his jaw tightening. "Hell, looks like Richard Miller's fine reputation has cracks." Daniel leaned forward. "I want to start with people close to Harper. Teachers, neighbors. We need a history." Ellison nodded. "Let's go, and take the dog. Sometimes dogs smell what people hide." The first stop was Seabrook Elementary, a low brick building with cheerful murals on the walls. Inside, children's laughter floated through hallways painted with dolphins and whales. Ms. Clara Jennings, Harper's second-grade teacher, met them in the classroom. She was a woman in her early 40s, with curly auburn hair, pale skin dotted with freckles, and wide green eyes that seemed to carry guilt even before Daniel asked a question. She wore a cardigan covered in chalk dust and carried the air of someone who tried hard to protect every child under her care. "Harper," she said softly, wringing her hands. "Yes, I've noticed things." She comes in quietly, withdrawn. Sometimes she winces when she lifts her backpack. Once, in art class, she spilled paint water and started sobbing, like she expected punishment. I tried to ask her, but Richard... She stopped herself, fear flickering in her eyes. "He's intimidating. You know his reputation here, the donations, the influence." Daniel's voice was steady. "You're safe to speak honestly. Anything you've seen matters." Clara's voice trembled. "Bruises, arms, back, always brushed off as falling at home. I wanted to report, but the principal, he said without proof. It would ruin lives. Ellison scribbled notes, his expression grim. Proof is exactly what we're after. That afternoon, Daniel and Ellison drove to Miller's Street, a long road lined with colonial houses behind trimmed hedges. Mrs. Dolores Green, the elderly neighbor, answered the door. She was short and plump, with silver hair pulled into a bun and bifocals perched low on her nose. She spoke with the bluntness of someone who'd lived too long to fear gossip. "That man's temper could curdle milk," she said flatly. "I've heard shouting, nights when the girl cried. Once I saw her outside in winter without a coat. I wanted to call someone, but Richard, well, he's got friends in high places. Folks don't cross him." Daniel thanked her, noting every word. At the next house, Mr. Steve Holloway, a middle-aged mechanic with oil-stained hands and a shy manner, admitted he'd seen Harper with bruises too. "Black eye once," he muttered. "She told me she tripped, but the way she said it, like she was told to repeat it." He shifted nervously. "I kept quiet. Didn't think anyone would believe me over a man like Miller." Each voice added weight, a pattern emerging. Harper's pain was visible, but fear of Richard's status had kept people silent. Late afternoon brought them back to the police impound, where Richard's SUV had been towed earlier for inspection. The black vehicle gleamed under fluorescent lights, its leather seats polished, the dashboard immaculate like everything else Richard owned. Daniel crouched beside Rex. "Find," he commanded softly. The German shepherd leapt into the back seat, nose working furiously. He moved methodically, sniffing floor mats, seat belts, and the trunk. Then he froze, head low, tail stiff. He pawed lightly at a coiled length of rope shoved beneath the rear compartment. Daniel pulled on gloves, sliding the rope into an evidence bag. A faint reddish-brown stain marred the fibers. Ellison bent close, his jaw tightening. "That's blood." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Fresh enough?" "We'll know after the lab," Ellison said. "But it doesn't belong in the back of a luxury SUV." Rex growled low, amber eyes fixed on the rope, as though it carried the ghost of violence. Daniel sealed the bag, heart heavy. "This isn't just discipline. This is control. Maybe worse." That night, Daniel sat at his desk, the evidence spread before him. Harper's drawing, the testimonies of neighbors and the teacher, the rope with its ominous stain. He opened Rebecca Miller's file, the wife who had fallen down the stairs 2 years ago. The coroner's note said accidental trauma, but Daniel read more closely. Broken ribs are inconsistent with a fall, bruises in different stages of healing, a pattern. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. His stormy blue eyes hardened, the weight of memory pressing in. Another child lost years ago still haunted him. But Harper was alive, and she had handed him her truth. The pieces were coming together, jagged and dark. Richard Miller's empire of respectability hid violence, and perhaps even murder. Daniel closed the file, Rex's head resting against his knee. "We're getting closer, boy," he murmured. "This time, we'll see it through." Rex's ears flicked, his amber eyes watchful. The hunt had begun. The Cumberland County Courthouse rose from the heart of town, like a stern reminder of justice, its red brick facade and white columns weathered by salt winds and decades of trials. On this particular morning, the winter sky pressed low, heavy clouds threatening snow. The flag whipped hard against its pole as townsfolk gathered, whispering about the spectacle to come. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The benches creaked under the weight of curious neighbors, teachers, and townspeople who had once shaken hands with Richard Miller at charity galas. They leaned in now, eager for a glimpse of the man whose spotless reputation was cracking. At the defense table sat Richard Miller, tall and polished in a tailored navy suit. His beard was trimmed razor sharp, his tie knotted with precision. Outwardly, he was the picture of dignity. Yet his blue eyes flickered with suppressed rage, and his hands curled too tightly around the edge of the table. He had prepared for this moment, certain that money, power, and the right lawyer would sweep away suspicion. Beside him was attorney Frank Caldwell, one of Portland's most expensive defense lawyers. Caldwell was in his mid-60s, silver-haired with a proud Roman nose and a heavy build that spoke of steak dinners more than gym workouts. His suits were impeccable, his gold watch gleaming whenever he gestured. Caldwell had a reputation, brilliant in cross-examinations, ruthless in strategy, and utterly without moral hesitation. To him, cases were battles to win, truth a malleable tool. At the opposite table sat Officer Daniel Harris, steady in his crisp Navy uniform, the badge gleaming at his chest. His stormy blue eyes stayed fixed, his posture upright, yet calm. At his feet, though not officially allowed in such hearings, lay Rex, the German shepherd, his amber eyes half-lidded but alert. The judge had permitted Rex to remain, citing Harper's fragile state and the dog's role in protecting her. Nurse Sarah Whitmore sat close by, a quiet but resolute presence, her brown braid looped neatly down her back. She had traded her scrubs for a simple gray sweater and slacks, but her hazel eyes still carried that unshakable steadiness that had guided her through the clinic discovery. The gavel struck. Judge Miriam Blake, a woman in her early 60s with sharp cheekbones and steel gray hair pulled into a bun, presided from the bench. Her reputation was one of fairness, tempered with iron resolve. Lines of experience etched her face, and her voice carried authority enough to silence the restless crowd. "This hearing," she announced, "is convened to determine temporary custody and safety arrangements for Harper Miller." Richard leaned back, his attorney Caldwell rising smoothly. "Your Honor," Caldwell began, his tone oily with confidence, "this case is nothing more than a tragic misunderstanding. My client, Mr. Richard Miller, is a respected businessman and grieving widower. The allegations raised against him are unfounded. Harper suffers from a condition purpura simplex, a disorder, causing frequent bruising even from the slightest bump. These so-called injuries are explained medically, not criminally." A murmur rippled through the room. Daniel rose when the judge's gaze turned to him. "Your Honor, with respect, medical explanations don't account for the evidence we've gathered. Nurse Whitmore documented patterned injuries inconsistent with accidental bruising. Multiple witnesses, including Harper's teacher and neighbors, testified to repeated signs of fear and visible marks. And yesterday, our K-9 partner Rex discovered a rope in Mr. Miller's vehicle with what appears to be bloodstains. That rope is under forensic analysis." Judge Blake's eyes sharpened. "Continue." Daniel's voice was calm, but edged with weight. Additionally, Harper herself provided testimony. In her own words, "Daddy hits me when I'm bad. Mommy in heaven tells him to punish me." These statements, combined with her drawings, point to a sustained pattern of abuse. There is reason to suspect even her mother's death may not have been an accident. Gasps echoed through the benches. Richard's jaw flexed, but Caldwell stepped in quickly, raising a hand. "Objection, hearsay, speculation, and inflammatory. The child is traumatized and easily influenced. To imply my client murdered his wife without a shred of formal charge is disgraceful." Judge Blake silenced him with a sharp rap of the gavel. "Mr. Caldwell, this is a custody hearing, not a criminal trial, but all relevant safety concerns will be heard." Richard leaned forward, his voice controlled but dangerous. "She's my daughter. She belongs with me. This entire circus is built on the word of a frightened little girl and a police officer who has a vendetta against me." Daniel did not flinch. "Your Honor, if I may, I'd like Harper herself to speak, with Rex present to help her feel safe." The judge considered, then nodded. "Bring her in." The side door opened. Harper Miller entered, clutching a stuffed toy borrowed from the police station, her braid loose now, strands falling around her pale face. She wore a simple sweater too big for her, sleeves pulled over her hands. She looked tiny in the expanse of the courtroom, yet Rex's ears perked and his tail brushed the floor as soon as he saw her. Guided by Sarah, Harper walked to the stand. She sat gingerly, Rex lying down right beside her feet. She placed a small hand on his fur, grounding herself. "Harper," Judge Blake said gently, her stern face softened. "Do you understand why you're here?" The child's gray-green eyes flicked to Richard, then back down to Rex. Her voice trembled but carried across the quiet room. "Because I don't feel safe at home." Caldwell rose, voice silken. "Harper, sweetheart, didn't you tell people once that you fell from a horse? That's how you got those bruises, isn't it?" Harper's small hands tightened in Rex's fur. "Daddy told me to say that," she whispered. The room held its breath. Richard's face reddened, but Harper's gaze stayed fixed on the dog. Judge Blake nodded gently. "And "What do you want now, Harper?" For the first time, Harper lifted her head high, her child's voice steadier than anyone expected. "I don't want to go back with Daddy. I want to stay where it's safe. With Officer Harris and Rex." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by Rex's soft, steady breathing at her feet. The courtroom was hushed when Judge Miriam Blake delivered her decision. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, painting bars of gold across the polished wood floor. The weight of the morning had pressed heavily on every shoulder, but now her words broke like a tide against stone. "For the safety of Harper Miller," Judge Blake declared, her voice ringing with authority, "temporary custody is hereby granted to her maternal aunt, Ms. Margaret Turner of Portland, Maine. Mr. Richard Miller will remain in custody pending further investigation into allegations of child abuse and the circumstances surrounding the death of his wife, Rebecca Miller." The gavel fell. A collective breath rushed through the room. Some neighbors lowered their heads in relief. Others exchanged wary glances, as though they had witnessed the crumbling of a man once untouchable. Richard Miller stood slowly, his tailored suit unable to disguise the fury boiling beneath his skin. His ice-blue eyes blazed, but the handcuffs snapped around his wrists before he could move toward Harper. The deputies on either side of him were firm, guiding him away from the table. He turned once, his voice low, venomous. This isn't over, but the courtroom no longer belonged to him. The authority he had wielded for years through money and intimidation dissolved beneath the gavel's final strike. From the benches, Margaret Turner rose, tears streaming freely. She was Rebecca's younger sister, a woman in her mid-30s with the same auburn hair, but worn in a loose bun, and a frame softened by years of working as a librarian. Her skin was pale, her hazel eyes tired, but full of warmth. She wore no jewelry beyond a silver chain necklace, simple as her life in Portland. She moved forward, kneeling so she was eye level with Harper. Her voice trembled but carried conviction. "Sweetheart, I'm your Aunt Margaret, your mommy. My sister always wanted you to know you'd never be alone." Harper stared, uncertainty clouding her gray-green eyes. Slowly, as if testing something fragile, she reached out. Margaret enfolded her in a gentle embrace, tears soaking the child's hair. Still, when the hearing ended, Harper clung to Rex more than anyone else. The German shepherd sat upright, calm and dignified, as if he knew the gravity of the moment. She wrapped her small arms around his neck, burying her face in his thick coat. "I don't want to leave you," she whispered. Her voice broke, a child's cry against the vast machinery of justice. Officer Daniel Harris crouched beside them. His stormy blue eyes softened, lines of sorrow etching deeper. "Harper, Rex will always be with you, even when he's not right beside you. You're safe now. That's what matters most." Harper lifted her face, streaked with tears, but glowing with something new hope. "Then I'll draw you, both of you, my three heroes, me, you, and Rex. That way, you'll always be with me." Daniel swallowed hard, steadying his voice. "I'd like that." Margaret took Harper's hand, guiding her gently toward the doors. The child looked back one last time, her braids swaying, her small figure dwarfed by the courthouse pillars. Rex gave a single, solemn thump of his tail, as if to say farewell. The courthouse emptied slowly, leaving Daniel standing at the base of the steps. The cold wind off Casco Bay bit at his face, but he didn't move. Rex stood beside him, ears pricked, amber eyes following the departing car that carried Harper away. For a long while, neither man nor dog spoke a word. Finally, Daniel rested a hand on Rex's head. "We did it, partner," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, weighted with exhaustion and relief. "We gave her a chance." Rex leaned into the touch, steady and strong, the silent answer of loyalty. Daniel's mind returned to another child, one he had lost years ago on a frozen night. That memory had haunted him, whispered failures into his heart. But now, as he looked at Rex, this steadfast companion who had shielded Harper when words were too small, he felt something shift inside him. Perhaps justice was still possible. Perhaps redemption came not in grand gestures, but in the simple act of protecting one child from the dark. In the weeks that followed, Seabrook murmured with the story. The powerful Richard Miller, once untouchable, now sat in a jail cell awaiting charges. The whispers about Rebecca's death, long dismissed as rumor, returned with sharp teeth. But more importantly, people remembered the sight of a small girl who had dared to speak the truth, and the officer and his dog who had stood beside her. That evening, Daniel drove back toward the coast. The sun was setting over the Atlantic, painting the horizon in fire and gold. Rex sat in the passenger seat, ears perked toward the wind. Daniel exhaled, slow and deep. "She'll be okay," he said quietly, almost to himself. "She's stronger than she knows." Rex turned his head, amber eyes meeting Daniel's, and let out a low, contented chuff. And for the first time in years, Daniel allowed himself to believe, not only in justice, but in hope. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not come as flashes of light from the heavens, but through the courage of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the steadfast heart of those who choose to protect the innocent. In Harper's story, we see how God's hand can guide justice through unexpected messengers, whether in the strength of an officer or the quiet devotion of a faithful German shepherd. And just as Harper found light after her darkest nights, may we remember that in our daily lives, no act of kindness is too small, no stand for truth too insignificant. God works His miracles through us, if only we dare to act with love and courage. If this story touched your heart, please share it with others. Leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe so that together we can spread more stories of hope. May the Lord bless and protect you and your loved ones today and always.